My name is Claire. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as someone dependable, the kind of woman people describe as calm, practical, easy to be around. I've been a wife, a professional, a quiet supporter of other people's ambitions. I've also been the person others assumed would absorb discomfort without complaint. If you met me before everything changed, you probably wouldn't have noticed me right away. I wasn't the loudest in the room. I didn't express my emotions or dramatize my struggles. I listened more than I spoke. I solved problems quietly. That made people comfortable. And over time, that comfort turned into something else, an assumption that I would always stay steady, that I wouldn't ask for too much, that if something hurt me, I'd process it privately and move on. This story isn't about rage or public humiliation or getting even. It's about what happens when someone mistakes silence for consent and calm for weakness. It's about how betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in familiarity, in routine, in the quiet confidence that the other person believes you won't do anything about it. When my husband cheated, he didn't think of himself as reckless. He thought he was safe. Safe because I was predictable. Safe because I was reasonable. Safe because I had always been the one to hold things together. He thought I'd stay quiet, not because he thought I deserved to, but because he thought I always would. What follows is not a story of sudden transformation or dramatic revenge. There are no villains, shouting monologues, and no moments where everything magically works out overnight. This is a story about patience, about observation, about the slow internal shift that happens when you finally see the truth of how you're being treated. And you decide very deliberately not to announce that realization to anyone. You'll hear about the small moments people dismiss, but never forget. The way disrespect gets normalized is not through cruelty, but through repetition. The role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it, and the quiet point at which silence stopped being something I endured and became something I chose. I'm telling the story in my own words, not to punish anyone, and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because there are so many people living inside similar dynamics, being underestimated, overlooked, quietly relied upon, who wonder whether noticing is enough, or whether action always has to be loud to be real. This is an honest account of how I moved from being unseen to being unmovable, without raising my voice or burning everything down. And if any part of this feels familiar to you, I want you to know, clarity doesn't have to look dramatic to be powerful. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized someone misunderstood your silence and felt that quiet shift inside when you knew you couldn't let that misunderstanding continue? Before anything broke, this is who I was to them. I was the reliable one. The woman who remembered birthdays without reminders, who noticed when the pantry was running low before anyone else did, who stayed late at work, not because I was asked to, but because unfinished things made me uneasy. People described me as low maintenance, a phrase that always sounded like a compliment until I understood what it really meant. It meant I didn't require much emotional labor from others. It meant I didn't disrupt the flow. To my husband, I was stability. I was the person who handled logistics so he could focus on bigger dreams. I scheduled repairs, tracked expenses, and remembered conversations he forgot he'd had. When he was stressed, I became quieter. When he was distant, I filled the silence so he wouldn't have to. I thought that was love, anticipating needs before they were spoken. To friends and family, I was the calm presence, the one who didn't gossip, didn't escalate conflict, didn't make scenes. If someone needed advice, they came to me. If someone needed help moving or planning or smoothing over an awkward situation, they assumed I'd say yes. And most of the time, I did. Not because I couldn't say no, but because it felt easier to be useful than to be visible. At work, I was competent to the point of invisibility. Projects ran smoothly, deadlines were met, crises were avoided. And because nothing ever exploded, no one looked too closely at who was holding everything together. My name rarely came up in meetings unless something needed fixing. I wasn't underestimated because I lacked ability. I was underestimated because I didn't demand recognition. And here's the part that matters most. I helped create that version of myself. Not consciously, not manipulatively, but gradually. Every time I chose peace over friction, every time I swallowed a small discomfort because it didn't seem worth it. Every time I told myself that being understanding was the same thing as being respected. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I had moments of genuine contentment. I believed in the life I was building. I believed in my marriage. I believed that consistency would eventually be met with care, that loyalty would be reciprocated simply because it was deserved. But being perceived as steady comes with a cost. People stop checking whether you're okay. They stop asking what you need. They start assuming your silence means agreement, your patience means capacity, and your presence means permission. No one thought of me as someone who would leave, or confront, or radically change course. I was the constant in everyone's equation, the known quantity. And when you become that, people stop imagining alternative outcomes that involve you choosing differently. If I'm honest, I didn't imagine it either. Not at first. I thought strength looked like endurance. I thought dignity meant not making others uncomfortable. I thought that as long as I wasn't being openly disrespected, everything else could be negotiated internally. I didn't yet understand that invisibility can coexist with apparent harmony, and that one often feeds the other. This is why what came later shocked people. Not because it was dramatic, but because it violated the role they'd assigned me, the role I'd quietly accepted without ever signing my name to it. Before betrayal, before clarity, before strategy, there was simply this: a woman everyone trusted to absorb whatever was inconvenient because she always had before. And the truth is, I did absorb it for a long time, calmly, competently, without complaint, until the day I noticed the first small cut. The first small cut didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a confession or a raised voice or anything that would justify alarm. If I had tried to explain it to someone at the time, I probably would have sounded petty. That's how these things survive, by staying just below the threshold of what feels reasonable to be upset about. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that blends into every other weeknight. My husband came home later than usual, distracted, already half inside his phone. I had made dinner, nothing elaborate, just something warm and familiar. We sat across from each other, and I asked a simple question about his day. He answered, but not really to me. His eyes stayed on the screen. The response was brief, mechanical, like a checkbox being ticked. And then, without looking up, he said something that landed wrong. A comment about how I wouldn't get it anyway, framed as a joke. Light enough to pass as humor, sharp enough to leave a mark. I remember smiling, not because it was funny, but because smiling kept the moment from turning into something heavier. I told myself he was tired. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was what long relationships looked like: imperfect, a little careless around the edges. But something in me recorded it. That's the thing people don't talk about. The body remembers what the mind tries to dismiss. I didn't argue. I didn't bring it up later. I didn't even change my tone. Outwardly, nothing happened. Inwardly, a small line was drawn. What stayed with me wasn't the comment itself, but the ease with which it was delivered, the confidence behind it. As if he knew, without question, that there would be no consequence, that I would absorb it, smooth it over, keep the evening intact. And I did. In the days that followed, I noticed how quickly everyone else forgot the moment, including him. If I hinted at it, lightly, he waved it off. "You're overthinking." I didn't mean it like that. "You know I was joking." Each response is reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a quiet erasure of my experience. So I did what I'd always done. I adjusted. I spoke a little less. I asked fewer questions. I made more room for his stress, his schedule, his moods. I told myself this was maturity, that choosing not to escalate was a form of wisdom. But the cut didn't heal. It stayed open just enough to sting when touched. I started noticing patterns I hadn't named before, how interruptions were becoming normal, how my opinions were acknowledged but rarely acted on, how my emotional labor was invisible because it was reliable. None of it is dramatic, all of it cumulative. The hardest part was how invisible my discomfort was to everyone else. Friends saw us as solid, balanced, a good couple. And because I wasn't crying or complaining, no one thought to ask deeper questions. Stability looks like success from the outside. I also didn't want to be the person who made a big deal out of something small. I had internalized that being easy to be with was a virtue. Those relationships required flexibility. Pointing out every hurt would make it difficult. So I told myself stories that kept me quiet. He didn't mean it. He's under pressure. This isn't worth creating tension. Each story made sense. Each one cost me a little more clarity. Looking back, I can see that this wasn't about a single comment. It was about the moment I realized my feelings could be minimized without consequence. There was a growing gap between how carefully I treated others and how casually I was being treated in return. At the time, I didn't call it disrespect. I called it normal, manageable, temporary. But that first small cut did what small cuts do best. It made the next one easier to ignore. And once you start ignoring them, something far more dangerous begins to take shape. After the first small's cut, nothing dramatically changed. That was the problem. Life continued. Mornings came and went. We made plans, paid bills, and talked about the future in broad, abstract ways. On the surface, everything still worked. And because it worked, I told myself there was nothing to fix. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive fully formed. It grows through repetition, through the quiet understanding that certain behaviors will go unchallenged. What had once felt like an exception slowly became part of the rhythm of our days. Interruptions became casual. He would start speaking before I finished, not aggressively, just as if my sentence was already predictable. Decisions were made without checking in first. Not big ones, nothing that would raise alarms, but enough to signal that my input was optional. If I expressed hesitation, it was framed as unnecessary worry. If I pushed back, even gently, I was told I was being serious or reading too much into it. I began to hear those phrases often. They're remarkably effective. They don't accuse you outright. They just reposition your emotional response as the problem. And because I valued being reasonable, I adjusted again. I softened my language. I second-guessed my reactions before voicing them. I learned how to phrase concerns in ways that wouldn't feel like demands. Silence at this stage wasn't strategic. It was adaptive. I believed I was preserving harmony. I believed I was choosing the bigger picture over momentary discomfort. I believed that long-term relationships required tolerance, that love meant letting small things go. What I didn't notice yet was how much of that tolerance was one-directional. When he was distant, I asked what he needed. When I was hurt, I asked myself what I could do differently. When he forgot something important to me, I found a way to make it less important. This wasn't a sacrifice in the heroic sense. It was erosion, slow, quiet, and invisible while it was happening. There were moments when clarity flickered, when I felt a sudden, sharp awareness that something wasn't balanced. But those moments were easy to smother under logic. No relationship is perfectly equal. Everyone has blind spots. You can't expect constant attunement. These were the thoughts that kept me anchored to a narrative where staying quiet was the mature choice. And then there was the social reinforcement. Friends praised how easygoing I was. Family admired how we never fought. Even he seemed proud of it, mentioning how drama-free our relationship was compared to others. Each comment rewarded my silence. Each one confirmed that I was doing something right. No one saw what that cost. I started to feel smaller in conversations, not because I had less to say, but because it felt less necessary to say it. My inner world grew more private. I wrote things down instead of speaking them aloud. I noticed, recorded, and stored moments the way some people store evidence without knowing yet what it will be used for. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't even fully name what was happening. Because normalizing disrespect doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like being patient, like being generous, like being the person who understands that everyone is flawed. But here's what patience becomes when it's never reciprocated. Permission. Without realizing it, I was teaching him how to treat me. Every unchallenged dismissal became part of the agreement. Every minimized feeling rewrote the boundaries a little more. And because I didn't protest loudly, it looked like consent. I remember one night lying awake next to him, listening to his breathing and feeling a strange mix of closeness and distance. I was physically there, emotionally present, but no longer fully seen. I knew things about him he didn't know about me, not because I was hiding, but because he had stopped asking. That's when I understood something, though I didn't act on it yet. Silence doesn't freeze a relationship in place. It slowly reshapes it. At the time, I still believed I could manage it, that I could recalibrate without disruption, that if I just stayed steady long enough, things would naturally rebalance. I didn't yet understand that the role I was slipping into had already been written for me, and I was playing it perfectly. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize you are no longer participating in a relationship as an equal, but as a function. I didn't notice it when it happened. I recognized it later, looking back, once the pattern had fully settled. My role had become clear, even if no one ever named it out loud. I was the stabilizer, the one who adjusted so others didn't have to, the person who made life run smoothly in the background, while someone else occupied the foreground. I handled what was unglamorous, repetitive, and emotionally laborious. In return, I was given trust, not the kind that invites closeness, but the kind that assumes compliance. He relied on me the way people rely on infrastructure. You don't thank it every day. You only notice it when it fails. Plans were made with the assumption that I would accommodate them. Changes were introduced as facts, not discussions. If something disrupted my routine, it was framed as flexibility I should naturally possess. And because I had always been capable, it was easy for everyone, including him, to believe that I always would be. What surprised me most wasn't his behavior. It was how familiar the role felt. I had played versions of it before, at work, in my family, among friends. I was the dependable one, the reasonable one, the person who could be counted on to manage without fuss. The difference now was the intimacy. When this dynamic exists in a marriage, it reshapes how you see yourself. You start measuring your worth by how little you require. You pride yourself on being undemanding. You confuse self-control with self-erasure. I didn't feel oppressed. I felt useful. And usefulness can be intoxicating when it's mistaken for love. There were signs, of course. Small moments where I realized my emotional reality was no longer central. Conversations that revolved around his needs, his stress, his trajectory. My inner life became an afterthought, not through malice, but through momentum. If I raised concerns, they were addressed efficiently, like tasks to be resolved, not experiences to be understood. A solution would be offered before empathy. Closure before curiosity. It made me feel unreasonable for wanting more than functionality. And so I stopped asking. I began to see myself through the lens of the role. Reliable, supportive, low friction. I edited myself accordingly. I chose words that wouldn't disrupt. I postponed feelings that didn't seem urgent. I learned how to wait. From the outside, this looked like strength. From the inside, it felt like being slowly relocated to the margins of my own life. The most unsettling realization was that no one had forced this on me. I had consented incrementally, not explicitly, not enthusiastically, but quietly. Every time I chose silence over clarity, I reinforced the role. Every time I prioritized being easy over being honest, I made myself easier to overlook. He didn't think of himself as someone taking advantage. He thought of himself as supported, secure, free to move without resistance. And why wouldn't he? The system worked. What changed wasn't an argument or a betrayal, not yet. It was awareness. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, watching him talk about plans he'd made that affected both of us. Plans he hadn't discussed with me beforehand. I nodded, asked practical questions, adjusted mentally, and then something in me stepped back and observed the scene as if it were happening to someone else. I saw the role clearly for the first time. I wasn't being consulted because I wasn't expected to object. I wasn't being considered because I had proven I would adapt. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I had become predictable. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. Not resigned, not hurt. Alert. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. Continue performing it or begin rewriting it. And rewriting doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with an internal shift. Subtle, deliberate, and completely invisible to everyone else. That shift began long before anyone noticed anything was wrong. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no discovery, no moment that would look significant from the outside. In fact, if you asked my husband about that day later, he wouldn't remember anything unusual at all. But I remember it with absolute clarity. It was a quiet afternoon. I was alone in the house, folding laundry, one of those automatic tasks that gives your mind too much room to wander. The windows were open. There was nothing urgent waiting for me. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced that didn't come with emotion attached to it. It was simple. This is not temporary. I had always framed my discomfort as something passing, a phase, stress, misalignment that would resolve itself if I stayed patient enough. But standing there, pairing socks without thinking about it, I suddenly understood that what I was experiencing wasn't a rough patch. It was a stable configuration. This wasn't a momentary imbalance. This was the structure of my life as it currently stood. And structures don't change unless someone intentionally alters them. What followed wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't demand immediate action, but quietly rearranges your priorities. I realized I had been waiting for evidence that something was wrong enough to justify change. A big mistake, a clear betrayal, something that would make my feelings undeniable. But the absence of respect doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it's simply the absence of curiosity, the absence of care, the absence of pause. That afternoon, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If nothing changes, can I live like this indefinitely? The answer came without hesitation. No. And what surprised me was how calm that answer felt. There was no panic, no urgency, just certainty. I didn't confront him that evening. I didn't hint at anything. I cooked dinner, listened, and responded where appropriate. On the surface, I was the same woman I had been the day before. Internally, something had clicked into place. I stopped explaining my feelings to myself in ways that minimized them. I stopped framing my silence as generosity. I stopped believing that endurance was inherently virtuous. Instead, I started observing with a different lens. Not the lens of someone hoping for improvement, but the lens of someone gathering information. I noticed how often my emotional labor went unacknowledged, how easily plans were made without my input, how comfortable he was assuming my availability, my agreement, my flexibility. None of it was new, but now I wasn't trying to excuse it. This wasn't about assigning blame. It was about seeing reality without editing it. That night, lying in bed, I felt something unfamiliar. Distance without resentment. I wasn't pulling away emotionally out of hurt. I was simply no longer investing in the illusion that things would resolve on their own. The shift was internal and deeply private. No one could have pointed to a change in my behavior. I still showed up. I still participated, but I stopped volunteering more than was asked. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fill. I stopped smoothing over moments that made me uncomfortable. Not as punishment, as data. There is power in quiet observation. When you stop reacting, people reveal patterns they didn't know were being watched. And because I wasn't signaling distress, there was no reason for anyone to adjust yet. That was important. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the dynamic. I was trying to understand it fully, without the distortion of hope. I began writing things down more intentionally. Dates, conversations, decisions. Not because I planned to use them, but because I wanted an accurate record. Memory can be softened by affection. Documentation cannot. I also noticed something else. My energy shifted. I felt less drained, less anxious, because I was no longer negotiating with myself about whether my feelings were valid. I had accepted them as information. That day marked the end of my confusion. Not the end of the relationship, not yet, but the end of my internal argument. From that point on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It became something I chose. Once silence became a choice, it changed its nature completely. Before, my quietness had been reactive, a way to keep things smooth, a way to avoid discomfort, mine and his. But after that internal shift, silence turned deliberate. It wasn't withdrawal. It wasn't passive aggression. It was a restraint. I stopped offering explanations that hadn't been requested. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't clearly communicated. I responded, but I didn't overextend. I listened, but I didn't absorb. From the outside, I was still calm, still agreeable. But the motivation had changed. I was no longer trying to preserve an image of harmony. I was preserving clarity. What surprised me was how quickly my silence was misinterpreted. He assumed nothing was wrong. More than that, he assumed things were better. With fewer questions, fewer emotional check-ins, and fewer pauses, life felt easier to him. My quiet looked like compliance. And because there was no confrontation, no visible resistance, there was no reason for him to reflect. This is the paradox people misunderstand. When someone stops reacting, it doesn't always mean they've accepted the situation. Sometimes it means they've stopped negotiating. I began to see how much of our dynamic relied on my emotional availability. Without it, conversations became shorter. Decisions became more unilateral. He filled the space I left behind with his own certainty. And in doing so, he revealed how little he noticed my inner world unless it demanded his attention. I paid attention to that. I noticed that when I didn't rush to reassure him, he didn't ask if I was okay. When I didn't smooth over a tense moment, he moved on quickly. When I didn't show enthusiasm, he interpreted neutrality as agreement. There was no malice in this, just an assumption. Assumptions are dangerous because they feel earned. My silence gave me something I hadn't had before: room to think, to feel, to plan, not in a dramatic sense, but in a grounded one. I began asking myself practical questions. What did I need? What would independence actually require? What parts of my life were intertwined and which were already separate? I didn't make lists labeled escape or exit. I made lists labeled understanding. Financial accounts, shared responsibilities, legal structures, patterns of behavior. I wasn't preparing to leave yet. I was preparing to see clearly. The more I observed, the more I realized how much power I had been carrying without recognizing it. I handled finances. I maintained schedules. I held institutional memory of our shared life. I knew where things were, how systems worked, what depended on what. I had mistaken that for a burden. It was leverage. But leverage is only useful when it's held quietly. At the same time, I worked on myself in ways that had nothing to do with him. I reconnected with parts of my life that didn't revolve around the marriage. Professional interests, friendships that didn't require me to perform stability. I invested in my own competence, not to prove anything, but to remind myself of who I was outside the role I'd been assigned. He noticed none of this. That's the thing about internal shifts. They don't register as threats. If anything, I became easier to be around, less emotionally demanding, less likely to challenge assumptions, and that reinforced his belief that everything was fine. I didn't correct that belief. Silence, when chosen, has a stabilizing effect. It allows others to continue exactly as they are, and that continuation is informative, because people show you who they are most clearly when they believe nothing needs to change. I wasn't waiting for a confession. I wasn't setting traps. I was watching alignment. I was learning where respect ended and convenience began. And slowly, I understood something that would become central later. My silence wasn't protecting the relationship. It was revealing it. By the time the truth emerged, by the time there was no denying what had been happening, my internal work was already done. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't destabilized. Because long before anyone else realized the ground was shifting, I had already stepped onto firmer footing. There's a strange freedom that comes when no one is watching you closely. When people believe you are predictable, they stop monitoring you. They stop asking questions. They stop imagining that you might be changing in ways that matter. That was the advantage no one noticed I had. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same routines, same tone, same reliability. But underneath that familiar surface, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I started by observing patterns, not incidents. Incidents can be explained away. Patterns cannot. I noticed how often he guarded his phone, not dramatically, not with obvious secrecy, but with a new precision. It was always face down now. How notifications were silenced when he was home. How certain conversations happened outside the room I was in. None of this triggered immediate conclusions. It triggered documentation. I began noting dates, times, and shifts in behavior. Not emotionally, methodically. I wrote down what I could verify, not what I suspected. I didn't interrogate him. I didn't ask leading questions. I let the behavior continue uninterrupted. People think preparation looks like plotting. It doesn't. It looks like patience. I also paid closer attention to our shared structures. Financial accounts, password access, subscription services, travel histories. I noticed discrepancies that had previously blended into the background of trust, charges that didn't align with known schedules, calendar gaps, expenses are categorized vaguely. Again, no confrontation, no accusations, just awareness. At the same time, I strengthened my own position quietly. I reviewed contracts, updated professional credentials, rebuilt connections I had allowed to weaken. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't frame it as contingency planning. I framed it as self-respect. He interpreted my focus as stability, productivity, reliability. It never occurred to him that I might be preparing for a future that didn't center him, because people rarely imagine the quiet one as the one who leaves. The more space I created internally, the more clearly I saw the dynamic at play. He was comfortable because nothing required his introspection. My silence gave him freedom, not just freedom of movement, but freedom from accountability. And he took it. What no one noticed was how carefully I was positioning myself. Not emotionally, structurally. I separated what could be separated without drawing attention. I made sure I understood my rights, my resources, my options. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning autonomy. There's a difference. I also began to emotionally disengage in a specific way. Not coldness, not withdrawal, but neutrality. I stopped anchoring my sense of self to his approval or presence. I didn't need reassurance because I had already given it to myself. This made it harder to manipulate, though he didn't realize it yet. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting. And when someone stops reacting, you lose your ability to steer them without effort. You have to actually see them again. But he didn't. I remember one evening when he came home unusually animated, distracted, in a way that felt rehearsed. He talked more than usual, laughed more than usual. It was an overcorrection, a signal that something elsewhere was exciting him. I listened. I asked neutral questions. I gave him nothing to push against, and he relaxed. That relaxation told me more than any argument ever could. From that point on, I understood that whatever was happening would reveal itself fully if left alone. Secrets rely on pressure to stay hidden. Remove the pressure, and they expand. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't afraid of what I might find, because by then I wasn't dependent on the outcome emotionally. I was anchored in clarity. I also understood something else. Whatever truth emerged, I would not announce it the moment I discovered it. Information is only power if you decide when and how to use it. So I waited, not passively, not hopefully, but with intention. I watched the way he moved through the world when he believed he was unobserved. I watched how easily he assumed my consent, how confidently he relied on my silence. What he didn't notice was that every assumption he made was being recorded, not in anger, but in preparation. And by the time the truth became undeniable, I already knew exactly what it meant and what I was going to do with it. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does when you stop chasing it. It revealed itself in fragments, small confirmations that aligned too cleanly to dismiss. A hotel charge in a city he hadn't mentioned traveling to. A calendar entry, labeled vaguely, repeated monthly. A name that appeared more than once, always just outside the margins of explanation. By the time I reached certainty, there was no spike of adrenaline, no racing heart, no cinematic moment of collapse. There was only stillness. I remember sitting at the dining table late one night, my notebook open, the house quiet. I laid everything out in front of me, not physically but mentally. Dates, transactions, patterns, absences. The timeline assembled itself without effort, like a puzzle that had been waiting patiently to be completed. This was no longer a suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. My husband was having an affair. What surprised me most was not the betrayal. It was how little I felt compelled to react. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel the urge to confront him immediately. I felt finished. Not finished with life, finished with doubt. The reveal wasn't emotional. It was informational. I didn't rush to tell anyone. Not friends, not family, not even myself, in the way people often do. Through dramatic internal dialogue. I acknowledged the truth, the way you acknowledge a diagnosis you've been preparing for. Calmly, fully, without denial. And then I asked myself one question, the only one that mattered. What does knowing this give me? It gave me clarity. I saw our past interactions differently now. The dismissiveness, the confidence, the assumption that I wouldn't push too hard, the belief that my silence meant safety. It all made sense. Not in a way that excused him, but in a way that removed confusion. Confusion is exhausting. Clarity is not. I didn't feel the need to punish him. I didn't feel the need to expose him. I didn't even feel the need to ask why. Why is a question people ask when they still believe answers will repair something? I no longer believe that. Instead, I focused on leverage. Not in the manipulative sense, but in the structural one. I understood the legal implications, the financial realities. The options available to me depend on timing, evidence, and discretion. I didn't celebrate what I had discovered. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The affair didn't make him a villain in my mind. It made him predictable. And predictability removes fear. I continued living as I had before. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't act suspicious. I didn't give him any indication that the ground beneath him had shifted, because confrontation would have given him something I no longer wanted to offer: control over the narrative. Silence protected my autonomy. I used that silence to think carefully, to consult quietly, to prepare responsibly. I spoke to professionals without framing myself as a victim. I framed myself as someone making informed decisions. No one panicked on my behalf. No one urged haste. That was intentional. In private moments, I allowed myself to feel whatever surfaced, but I didn't dwell there. Anger passed quickly. Sadness came in waves and receded. What remained was resolved. The affair didn't destroy me because I had already disentangled my worth from his behavior. His choices were no longer a referendum on my values. They were data points. And data points lead to decisions. By the time I closed my notebook that night, I wasn't wondering if something needed to change. I was deciding how. There were multiple paths forward, some loud, some quiet, some reversible, some not. I understood then that the power of this moment wasn't in exposing the truth, but in choosing when and how it would matter. The private reveal wasn't the end of anything. It was the moment I stopped being reactive and became decisive. Once you know the truth, pretending you don't is a choice. And once you see all your options laid out clearly, indecision becomes its own form of action. This was the point where everything could have gone in a different direction. I gave myself time, not to cool down, but to think without distortion. I imagined each possible path, not in abstract terms, but in lived reality. What would it feel like 6 months later, a year later? What kind of woman would I recognize myself as in each outcome? One option was confrontation, immediate, emotional, honest. I could have laid everything out, demanded explanations, watched him scramble to reframe the narrative. That path would have given me release. It would have given him a chance to respond on his terms. I didn't want that. Another option was endurance. I could have stayed, quietly carrying the knowledge, preserving the structure of our life, at the cost of my own integrity. Many people do this. They survive. They adapt. They call it strength. I didn't want that either. There was also exposure, telling family, friends, letting social consequences do the work of accountability. But public truth often becomes performance. And I wasn't interested in managing other people's reactions while I was still deciding who I needed to be. The option that remained was the least visible and the most irreversible. I chose to act in a way that didn't require his cooperation, his understanding, or his remorse. I chose a path that centered my future, not his apology. That decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt final. I understood that once I moved forward, there would be no return to ignorance, no comfortable ambiguity. I would lose the safety of familiarity. I would disrupt a life that, while flawed, was stable. But stability without respect is just inertia. I didn't announce my choice. I didn't mark the day on a calendar. I simply stopped imagining scenarios where the relationship continued as it was. In my mind, that chapter closed quietly. What helped me commit was this realization. Confronting him would not restore the version of the relationship I thought I had. Staying silent forever would cost me myself. But choosing autonomy, choosing to leave on my own terms, aligned with my values. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. I was honoring a boundary I had ignored for too long. This wasn't about infidelity alone. It was about the cumulative absence of respect, the assumptions, the entitlement, the quiet confidence that my silence equaled permission. I decided that the only response that truly addressed that pattern was one that removed me from it entirely. Once that decision was made, my emotional energy shifted again. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't monitoring my reactions. I felt lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because the internal conflict was. I knew what I was doing, and more importantly, I knew why. There is a moment in every irreversible decision where fear surfaces, not of the unknown, but of being fully responsible for your life. I felt that fear, I acknowledged it, and I didn't let it override clarity. I reminded myself, choosing yourself is not an act of aggression, it's an act of alignment. From that point on, every step I took was in service of that alignment. Quietly, methodically, without asking permission. The decision point wasn't loud. No one around me noticed anything had changed. But from that moment forward, everything I did had direction. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to rush. Urgency would have introduced mistakes. What I needed now was precision. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing everything without announcing it. I began with the practical layers of my life, the ones that determine how much freedom you actually have when emotions are no longer guiding you. I reviewed financial structures carefully, not with suspicion, but with accuracy. I wanted to understand what was shared, what was separate, and what could become either depending on timing. I organized documents I had never needed to look at closely before. Policies, statements, agreements. Not because I expected a fight, but because I refused to be uninformed. Knowledge creates options. Ignorance creates dependency. I also adjusted my professional life subtly. I didn't quit anything. I didn't change jobs overnight. I strengthened my position where I was. I took on projects that expanded my autonomy. I made myself less replaceable, not out of fear, but out of respect for my future self. All of this happened without conversation, without tension, without signals. At home, nothing looked different. I still participated in daily life. I still spoke kindly. I still fulfilled shared responsibilities. But I no longer overfunctioned. I did my part, not everyone's. And because I didn't announce this shift, it went unnoticed. He remained confident, comfortable, assured that the system worked as it always had. He made plans assuming my presence. He spoke about the future in general terms, unaware that I was already planning a different one. What struck me during this phase was how invisible preparation is when it's done quietly. People assume change is preceded by drama. They look for emotional cues, raised voices, withdrawals, ultimatums. When none of those appear, they assume safety. I let that assumption stand. I also gave myself time emotionally, not to grieve the relationship, but to detach from the version of myself that had needed it. I didn't rush closure. I allowed moments of sadness without interpreting them as doubt. Feeling something doesn't mean you've made the wrong decision. It means you're human. There were days when I felt almost normal, days when I forgot briefly that everything was shifting underneath. And then there were moments when the reality returned sharply, when I watched him move through the house with certainty, unaware that certainty no longer included me. Those moments didn't destabilize me. They clarified why silence mattered. If I had confronted him too early, the narrative would have changed. Apologies would have entered, promises, emotional turbulence, and with turbulence comes confusion. Silence kept the terrain stable while I crossed it. I also noticed how little he checked in with me during this period, how easily he accepted my neutrality. It confirmed something I already knew. He was comfortable as long as nothing demanded his reflection. That comfort would not last, but it didn't need to end dramatically. By the time the external consequences began to unfold, the internal work was complete. I wasn't reacting to events as they happened. I was watching them align with decisions already made. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about protecting your clarity long enough to act on it. And when the shift finally became visible to others, it didn't look like rebellion. It looked like inevitability. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. At first, nothing obvious happened. No confrontation, no dramatic shift in daily routine. But the subtle systems that had relied on my quiet participation began to strain. I stopped compensating. When plans were poorly thought through, I didn't fix them preemptively. When emotional gaps appeared, I didn't bridge them automatically. When assumptions were made about my availability, I let them remain assumptions. The result wasn't chaos, it was friction. Small things started to go wrong. Not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed. Appointments were missed. Details were overlooked. Conversations ended unresolved instead of being smoothed over. He felt it before he understood it. I could see the confusion forming. He would ask questions indirectly at first. Have you noticed things feeling off lately? Are you tired? Did I do something? These questions weren't rooted in self-reflection. They were attempts to restore the familiar equilibrium. I answered honestly, but minimally. I wasn't cold, I wasn't evasive, I simply didn't over-explain. And because I didn't name the real cause, he couldn't address it. That's when the discomfort set in. People are unsettled when the rules change without announcement, when behavior that once guaranteed stability no longer does. He began to sense loss, not of me exactly, but of the ease he had grown accustomed to. He tried to compensate in ways that didn't require accountability. Small gestures, surface-level attentiveness, increased presence without increased awareness. It was an effort to regain comfort, not to understand its source. I didn't reject these gestures, I accepted them neutrally. Gratitude without attachment. That neutrality was disorienting. The more I withdrew my emotional labor, the more exposed the imbalance became. Without my constant calibration, his choices had weight, his absences were felt, his assumptions landed differently. Still, I said nothing, because the consequences weren't meant to teach him. They were meant to free me. I noticed how quickly anxiety replaced his confidence. How often did he check my mood? How carefully he watched my reactions now that they were no longer predictable. My silence, once invisible, had become noticeable by its absence of reassurance. And yet, even then, he didn't suspect the truth. He sensed a shift but couldn't locate it. Because from his perspective, nothing bad enough had happened to justify alarm. There had been no fight, no accusation, no ultimatum, just distance. The distance had been growing quietly for months. Friends began to notice something too, though they couldn't name it. They commented that I seemed different, calmer, more self-contained, less available but not unhappy. They interpreted it as personal growth. They weren't wrong. What they didn't see was how carefully I was disentangling myself from a life that no longer aligned with me. How every consequence unfolding around him was the result of a structure I had already stepped out of. By the time he began to feel real unease, by the time he sensed that something essential was slipping beyond his reach, it was already too late to return to how things had been. Because what he was losing wasn't affection, it was access. And access, once quietly revoked, is not easily restored. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he was already reacting to consequences that couldn't be undone. The shift in him was subtle at first. Concern replaced assumption, attention replaced indifference. He started asking questions that came a little too late, in a tone that suggested urgency rather than curiosity. Are you happy? Have I done something to upset you? Talk to me. These weren't bad questions. In another timeline, they might have mattered. But questions asked in panic don't land the same way as questions asked in care. I answered them honestly, but not expansively. I didn't deflect. I didn't accuse. I didn't open emotional doors that I had already closed privately. And that was the moment he understood that reassurance was no longer available on demand. He tried to restore closeness through familiarity, recalling shared memories, talking about future plans as if they were still jointly owned. His voice carried something new now, a hint of uncertainty. I listened, I didn't interrupt, and I didn't correct him, because the future he was describing no longer existed for me. What unsettled him most was that I wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier to engage with. Anger invites repair. Calm indifference does not. He began to sense that whatever had shifted in me wasn't reactive. It was resolved. There were attempts at self-improvement, more presence at home, more attentiveness in conversation, small acknowledgments of things he'd overlooked before. These efforts weren't insincere. They were simply late. Change made in response to loss feels different from change made in respect. At some point, he asked me directly if there was someone else. The question revealed how far removed he was from the truth. He was still searching for external explanations, still unable to imagine that the rupture came from his own choices. I said no, calmly, truthfully. What I didn't say was that there didn't need to be someone else. The space had already been created. The panic set in gradually, not explosive, quiet. He began watching me the way I had once watched him, looking for signals, reading into tone, trying to anticipate. But he lacked something I had built over time. Patience. He wanted answers now. Resolution now? 0 to now. And I couldn't give him what he wanted without betraying myself. This wasn't punishment. It was a consequence. I had spent months coming to terms with reality. He was encountering it for the first time. The imbalance in timing made reconciliation impossible. We were standing in different emotional seasons, and there was no way to synchronize them. The hardest part wasn't saying no. It was staying quiet when I could see his confusion deepen. When I recognized the moment he realized he no longer had control over the narrative. Control had always been subtle. It had lived in assumption, in my predictability, in the belief that I would always be there to stabilize things. Now that belief was gone, and with it, the illusion that things could simply be fixed. There are moments when people want to repair damage, not because they understand it, but because they fear the consequences of not repairing it. That fear is not the same as accountability. By the time he was ready to face the truth, really face it, I had already moved beyond the need for explanations. It wasn't that he couldn't change. It was that change that no longer addressed what had been lost. Respect doesn't return on a schedule, and once clarity replaces hope, you can't unsee it. For him, the realization came too late. For me, it came right on time. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like people imagine. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown back and forth, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. By the time we sat down to talk, the emotional intensity had already passed, at least for me. It happened on an ordinary evening. No special timing, no carefully staged moment. I chose it because I was ready, not because circumstances demanded it. I told him I knew. I didn't list details. I didn't recount timelines. I didn't name the other person. I didn't need to. The truth landed fully formed the moment the words left my mouth. His reaction was immediate and unguarded. Shock, followed by a kind of disbelief that had nothing to do with the affair itself and everything to do with me. He hadn't believed I would ever know, or if I did, I would respond like this. Calm, composed, certain, he began to explain. Not aggressively, not defensively at first, just urgently, as if the right sequence of words might still change the outcome. He spoke about stress, distance, and confusion. He spoke about how it didn't mean anything. I listened. That more than anything seemed to unsettle him. When he paused, waiting for a response, I told him something simple. That the affair wasn't the only reason I was leaving. That it was the clearest one, but not the first. I explained, without blame, without heat, that I had felt unseen for a long time. That I had carried more than my share of the emotional weight. That I had been quiet, not because I was unaware, but because I was observing. He tried to interrupt. I asked him not to. That was the only firm boundary I drew in that conversation. I told him I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking punishment. I wasn't interested in repairing something that had been slowly eroded long before the affair began. He asked if we could try again. Counseling, space, anything. I told him I had already tried, just not out loud. That sentence landed harder than anything else I said. The realization that the most important work had happened without his participation, that the decision had been made quietly over time, left him disoriented. He had been preparing for a fight. He wasn't prepared for finality. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse lines. I simply told the truth as I understood it. There is a strange power in confrontation without emotion. It removes the other person's ability to redirect the moment. There is no anger to soothe, no hysteria to dismiss, no volatility to wait out. There is only reality. The conversation didn't last long. There was nothing left to negotiate. I had already negotiated with myself and reached a conclusion. When it ended, there was no sense of victory, only relief. Not because he finally knew, but because I no longer had to carry knowledge alone. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, because closure doesn't always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from alignment. Bạn đã sẵn sàng để tiếp tục part 14 chưa? Part 14, Who I Am Now, 650-800 words. After everything settled, after the logistics had been handled and the silence no longer needed to protect me, I noticed something unexpected. I didn't feel lighter in a dramatic way. I felt steadier. The version of me that emerged wasn't sharper, louder, or hardened. I didn't become cynical. I didn't lose my softness. What changed was my orientation, to myself, to others, to silence. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. For a long time, I believed being strong meant staying. That loyalty meant absorbing discomfort quietly. That love was measured by how much you could tolerate without complaint. Letting go of those beliefs didn't make me colder. It made me more precise. I'm still calm, still observant, still thoughtful, but I no longer disappear inside those qualities. I speak when something matters to me. Not urgently, not defensively, but clearly. I don't over-explain. I don't rush to make myself understandable at the cost of my own boundaries. If something feels misaligned, I trust that feeling long enough to examine it instead of dismissing it. What I've learned is this: being underestimated is only dangerous when you internalize it. I didn't need to become someone else to reclaim myself. I needed to stop performing a role that benefited everyone but me. Once that stopped, the rest followed naturally. People relate to me differently now. Some connections deepened, others faded. That's not loss, it's sorting. When you stop over-functioning, only relationships built on mutual awareness remain. I don't regret the quiet years. They taught me discernment. They showed me how power moves without noise. They taught me that preparation is not bitterness, and silence is not weakness when it's chosen. And I don't regret leaving without spectacle. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need validation from people who hadn't seen the full picture anyway. The clarity I gained was enough. If I could name the core difference between who I was then and who I am now, it's this. I no longer wait to be seen. I see myself, and that changes how everything else aligns. There is no resentment here, no desire to rewrite the past. The woman I was did the best she could with what she understood at the time. The woman I am now honors her by living differently. Not louder, just truer. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about self-possession, about knowing when silence serves you and when it no longer does. I don't fear being underestimated anymore. I understand it, and I move accordingly. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story all the way through without dramatizing it, without turning it into a spectacle. Not because what happened was small, but because the most important parts of it were quiet. We're taught to believe that power looks loud, that justice looks explosive, that leaving means slamming doors, naming villains, and making sure everyone understands what you endured. But that's only one version of strength, and it's not the one that saved me. What saved me was listening. Listening to the discomfort I kept explaining away. Listening to the patterns instead of the excuses. Listening to the moment my body understood the truth before my mouth could say it out loud. For a long time, I thought silence was something that happened to me, something imposed by circumstance, by personality, by my desire to keep peace. I didn't realize that silence could be reclaimed, that it could become a deliberate space where clarity forms. This story isn't about my husband's betrayal as a singular act. It's about what happens when someone mistakes consistency for consent, when they assume that because you've been quiet before, you'll always be quiet, when they build their confidence on your patience. And it's about what happens when that assumption is wrong. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't need to be believed by everyone. I didn't need to rewrite the past to justify my decision. I simply chose to stop participating in a dynamic that required my disappearance. That choice didn't make me harder. It made me whole. If there's a moral here, it isn't leave at the first sign of trouble, or never forgive, or always plan an exit. It's simpler and harder than that. Pay attention to what costs you clarity. Notice where your silence is coming from. Is it fear or is it strategy? Is it exhaustion or is it discernment? Are you staying quiet because you feel safe or because you've learned it's easier than being heard? You don't owe anyone access to your inner world if they haven't shown care for it. You don't owe endless patience to someone who treats it like entitlement. And you don't need permission to choose yourself quietly. Sometimes the most powerful boundary you can set is the one you don't announce, the one that simply changes what you will and will not participate in anymore. If this story resonated with you, I'm not asking you to judge anyone in it. I'm inviting you to reflect on your own patterns, the moments you minimized, the roles you accepted without realizing it, the silence you've carried. So I'll leave you with one question, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever reached a point where staying quiet stopped being about keeping the peace and started being about protecting yourself?